Welcome back. So today we're going to finally take a look at the Wold GK10. So you're probably asking yourself, why on earth were you talking about this set? Didn't it go away after tons of quality control problems, broken drivers, channel mismatch, blocked vents? Yeah, it did. And I thought it went away, and I had actually put mine away in the closet, never to be seen again. And then Hi-Fi Go said, hey, you ever going to get around to doing that GK10 review? And so long story short, back when the GK10 was actually popular, I bought it from Hi-Fi Go, paid my own money for it, bought it from their Amazon store, received it, measured it, and said, it looks like I actually got a good one. This is cool. And then shortly after, Hi-Fi Go had reached out to me and said, hey, we have a review sample of GK10 available. Are you interested? And I said, nope. I already have it. Measured it. It looked okay. And I'll probably review it someday. So I think they took that as, I will review that someday soon. Or at least at some point. And I had actually no intention on reviewing it since it has faded from everyone's attention, and I don't care too much about it either. But here we are again, and they were interested in having a review of it for some unknown reason, and I wasn't going to question it, as they have been quite good to me throughout the year, giving me other review samples. So here we go. So Geek World GK10 listed on Hi-Fi Go for $45, probably the same exact price I paid for it, 6 months ago in the middle of summer, when this one was very popular and in everyone's eye. So it is a 5 driver, so it's 1 BA, 2 piezoelectrics, and 2 dynamic drivers. It looks like this. It's got this stabilized wood faceplate, which is actually pretty cool. Plastic shell, and that kind of nozzle. Not the stock cable. I don't even know where my stock cable went, but it wasn't all that fancy. This is kind of a nice black sleeved C4i kind of ish cable, so quite nice. So the other reason why I sort of agreed to do it was because it very much reminded me of the KZ ZEX. And if you look at when the Geek World came out and this frequency graph was published, it was, oh, that's kind of an interesting tuning. You don't see it all that often, especially in budget sets and not tribrid sets at that price range. So lots of people interested in hearing this kind of tuning. And so after the GK10 faded from everyone's eye, the ZEX actually did a very similar, big mid-bass hump, bleeding well into the mids, and then this kind of extended treble type of tuning. So if the GK10 was something of interest to you back then and you never got around to buying it, do be aware that the ZEX isn't all that far, and they're definitely not, they don't sound the same. I would say the tuning is somewhat similar. They don't sound the same, mainly because of the driver configurations. This is actually quite different between the two, but the main feature that people kind of poked at with the GK10 is this sort of big mid-bass bump, going heavily into the mids, and that's kind of the foundation of the sound. And then you get the piezo BA kind of extended sharp lower treble kind of sound. I probably would say the same thing, similar things about the ZEX, but we'll at least talk about it. So like I said, it is where the ZEX is a 3-driver tribrid, this one actually is a tribrid with 5 drivers, so 2 piezos and 2 dynamic drivers and 1 BA. So first thing I sort of noticed about the GK10, it's a low volume specialist. I don't know how people were able to listen to this one at regular volume. I think I found it kind of super fatiguing at higher volumes. It's got some weird sibilance, and I think at that point when mine measured okay, but when I heard the sibilance, I'm like, I wonder if mine is actually a bad unit. I mean, there's a lot of sibilance there. You hear it in tracks that I never heard sibilance before. It's quite prominent, but if you listen at low volume, you almost never hear it. You know, you can get it to the point where you don't hear it at all, but you're at a pretty low volume. So I don't know. I would say my measure's okay, but the amount of sibilance on the vocals sort of says maybe something's not all that right with my unit. But you know what's common to all the units, very much a sub bass roll off. It ends up being kind of a heavy, punchy, weird bassy sound with almost no back end to it. I don't know. I don't know how else to describe it other than it's kind of an odd bass sound. It sounds almost detached because you get the mid bass, but then there's nothing behind it. It just kind of hangs out there, and there's kind of a very low sub bass ish sound there, but it's kind of detached from the mid bass. And so, I mean, my opinion is it really limits your music. And electronic music that isn't bassy at all is sort of where it, I think, sounds good. And I think people who like the GK10 at the time, I think electronic music was one of those genres that actually worked pretty well for it. You just can't go too heavy at all beyond the mid bass. And, you know, kind of from the bump up, it sounds pretty good. But from when you're expecting to hear something out here, not so good. So the lack of coherence, or is it a separation specialist? And I'll kind of talk about this in terms of when things you would typically call them bad end up sounding good. And the BL03, I think, is just one of those classic examples of people say it's all congested and muddy and the mids have so much bleed into it. You know, there's all these bad things about it, yet it sounds good. And millions of people bought the BL03 for that reason, because it sounds good to millions of people. And I think with the GK10, it had something very similar, but not, I mean, it does have a ton of mid bass going into the mids, but I'm not referring to the BL3 literally, but the sound, the way things are separated across the three drivers, you know, some people are going to say that's a lack of coherence, three drivers sounding all separate, sounds kind of weird and not right and bad. And then other people will listen to it and you're like, that kind of sounds very different. It's kind of likable. I sort of know in the back of my mind it's not right, but I still like to listen to it. It's sort of addictive. And I think that's where the GK10 sort of took off. It presented your tracks in sort of a slightly different, not necessarily right or correct in review terminology or critical listening way, but there was something to your ear that was a little bit addictive and new and different, and especially at this price range, it was, you know, cheap to try. So I think, you know, I think it did have there was some validity behind the hype. Some people really got caught up in that kind of sound, and for me personally, electronic music sounded better. I really couldn't take anything with vocals, but you know, you sort of see a glimmer of why people were attracted to it. And it's, you know, I think it's this kind of concept of it may not be correct, but it still sounds somewhat good, interesting, you know, curious, different. You know, I get to hear my tracks over and over again played on this, you know, 5-driver set. So yeah, I think there definitely was something there to it that caught people's ear, but, you know, I also understand why people say it should have been 5 drivers sounding as one and not 3. So a little good and a little bad there, but that's the way it sort of comes across, is it's not like a unified single driver. It very much has its areas of bass, mids, and sort of lower treble very distinctly separated. So the balance tilts bright, and that pretty much colors all the sound, and that's another reason why I say electronic music sounds a little better. Vocals and instruments are just a little bright and colored and kind of weird sounding. So the bass, like I said, lots of mid bass, not much low for body. It kind of comes across as tinny and punchy, but it works well on tracks that are not bass driven. And what is there is kind of sounds okay, but you really notice the part that's missing more so than what is there sounding good. And that's just kind of my 2 cents on it. It just sounds weird. I don't know. It's just weird. So Deadmau5's Strobe is one of these tracks where there's lots of strings kind of up here, and those all sound great or pretty good on the GK10. But then when you're supposed to get that low rumble on this side, it's just not there. And what's there sounds weird. So yeah, I don't know. I wasn't not so much a fan. And you can poke at the bass and say, well, it's not the fastest, it's not the slowest, there's some detail there. Yeah, whatever. It's just missing a whole bunch of low end, so it doesn't really sound all that right. So the mids, I mean, what you really notice about the mids is the upper mids are bright and forward, kind of nicely detailed, but they're vivid and natural. It's almost like turning the color on your TV up way into like the vivid mode. It just pops out. And again, it's this concept of you're hearing it differently than maybe what you're used to. It's not exactly correct, but it's kind of there and vivid and in your face, and I think that did attract people to the GK10 as well, but it's not quite natural. It just kind of sounds energetic and forward, and yeah, I don't know, it's just different. But the lower mids, when you get into something like Harry Styles Golden, it's just kind of murkiness. This whole mid bass section, this whole thick mid kind of thing, you're pretty much, just by looking at the graph, you knew that was going to be about as murky as it sounds, and it pretty much does. So treble, kind of good extension, details, but that sibilance is pretty killer for me. I mean, it's been a while since I've heard a set that had that much sibilance, and it's everywhere. So, I mean, what it sounds like to me is they just pushed it too far at a certain volume. Like I said, pump the volume down and you get it down to somewhere where you don't hear it as much, but yeah, kind of wacky amount of sibilance on this one. And that's, I think there was a maze of obstacles to run to get this one to sound right. You had to burn it in for 100 hours, have a different cable, different tips, different sources. I don't know. I'm sure there's some explanation as to why mine has too much sibilance, and it probably has to do with one of those hurdles that I'm not willing to jump through at this point in time. So the stage is probably that one bit that actually sounds like a more expensive set, and I remember people talking about how the GK10 sounded like a really expensive whatever. The stage, especially on electronic music, on a track like Deadmau5's Strobe, it actually does sound quite good and immersive, and other times it can sound average, but I think that part, that amount of treble, I think it actually does the stage pretty well. And I think that was, when I wasn't listening to vocals and just hearing some electronic music, I think the stage was actually pretty good, and kind of one of my favorite parts of the GK10. So that's the wrap up. Again, if you're considering the GK10, do be aware that there are a ton of quality control problems, and you may get drivers that fail, you may get vents that are blocked, channels that are mismatched. There is a whole host of things that went wrong with it, but I don't know. I think they had actually announced a GK10 revision, which never appeared, so I don't know if that's still in the works or what happened to it, but do be aware that this one does have issues. And so thank you guys again for tuning in, and I will see you next time.